Hi, grade fives. So today we're going to be starting a new unit in social studies, and it is where did the early French and British settle? We are going to be looking at this in Canada, but it will mostly be focusing on where did the early French and British settle in Atlantic Canada, which would include New Brunswick, PEI, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland and Labrador. So, as I said, these are some of the questions we're going to be covering in the unit. So, where did the early British and French settle? How did the environment influence where they settled? How did their lives change? And how did First Nations, Inuit, and early British and French interact with one another? So, this is a picture from your book. And I felt that it was important because it does point out four examples of the early British and French settlements in the 1700s. So, Europeans were interested in what is now Atlantic Canada because of natural resources such as fish and fur. Early British and French settlers chose areas to settle based on access to these resources. Most of these settlements were along coastlines. In the 1600s, most European presence was migratory, meaning that people moved around a lot. There were very few settlements. In the 1700s, permanent settlements began to develop. So there are four examples of settlements that they are showing you on the map. So one of them is St. Peter's Harbor, which is located in Prince Edward Island. Number 2 is Moncton, New Brunswick. 3 is Trinity in Newfoundland and Labrador. And number 4 is the Fortress of Louisbourg, National Historic Site of Canada in Nova Scotia, which is located in Sydney. So the map shows many British and French settlements in the now Atlantic provinces. How is the settlement pattern on this map linked to the location of natural resources? So why do you think, based on, now that you can see the location of some of these early settlements, why do you think that the early British and French would have chosen to settle in these areas? What about each of these areas kind of makes them unique? So maybe think about that question as we kind of move along. So between the early 1600s and the mid 1700s, the British and the French, in an effort to acquire land and resources, both tried to take control of the Atlantic region. By the early 1700s, the British were successful in gaining control over French territories in what would later become Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Newfoundland and Labrador. The British would eventually take control over Ile Saint-Jean and Prince Edward Island and Ile Royale and Cape Breton in the middle of the 1700s. Historic sites and archaeological findings in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland and Labrador show how early English and early French settlers and soldiers lived in the region. So we did discuss the role of an archaeologist earlier this year and kind of how they deal with dig sites. So by doing that research, we can kind of draw some conclusions about how the early British and French would have lived and where they would have settled. The first European settlers of the region called Acadia were French. Their descendants are called the Acadians. In the 1600s, Acadians settled in Port Royal, Minas Bay, and in Chignecto Bay. These settlements were near marshland that were drained and became a source of rich, fertile soil for crops. Port Royal was built in 1605 in the area of what is now Annapolis Royal, Nova Scotia. French explorers chose to settle here because of the good quality of the soil on the river basin and the many fish and animals. The Mi'kmaq helped settlers adapt to the land and the climate. So what I would like you to do today, grade 5s, is to choose either Acadia or the Fortress of Louisbourg. You're going to research answers to the questions in the attached Google slide, which I will show you in a minute. Please record these answers in your own words. You can use the internet to gather information, but that information should not be copied and pasted directly from a website. Please also be mindful of spelling and punctuation. If you are unsure of your spelling and punctuation, read it out loud before submitting it so that you can double check over your work. So I'm going to show you quickly what your slideshow will look like. Everybody will get their own. So the slide is blue. You will put the name of your chosen friend settlement here, whether it be Acadia or Fortress Louisbourg, and put your own name and title. There are only about 4 questions. So question 1 is, when did the French settle there? Question 2 is, approximately how many people settled here? So I know you can't kind of find an exact number of people, and the number of people will differ depending on like the year that you might look up. So just give an approximate, give kind of like an estimate of how many people would have settled in that area. What were the reasons for settling in either Acadia or in Louisbourg? So as we kind of discussed, some of them might be based on the quality of the land or access to resources. Those might be some reasons, but there might be other reasons as well. So kind of take that into consideration when you're doing your research. Now, number 4 will take a little bit more kind of reading and work. So just kind of be mindful of that as you move through these questions. Question 4 is, what happened to these 2 French settlements? So you don't have to, give a big, huge report on what happened. If you could just write a paragraph with some important dates of certain kind of events that would have occurred, that would be a good way to answer that question, I feel. So that is what you will be doing for this assignment. If you have any questions, feel free to message me in the Google Classroom or in the assignment. Send me a Gmail, and good luck, and we'll be chatting soon. Bye-bye.